The doctrine of St. Francis de Sales in regard to contemplation, taken from the Treatise on the Love of God. Divine love seeks solitude and silence. Prayer may be called a manna on account of the different flavors and divine sweets which love discovers to those who make use of it. But it is a hidden manna which falls in the desert before the dawn of day. That is to say, it is not the fruit of lights and science. Its sweets can only be tasted in solitude. When we converse with God alone, then we may say of the soul, "Who is she that goeth up by the desert, as a pillar of smoke of aromatical spices of myrrh and frankincense, and of all the powders of the perfumer?" Canticles 3:6. It is the spouse herself who entreats her beloved to conduct her into solitude, that they may both converse in secret. "Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field, let us abide in the villages." The great attraction which persons of prayer experience is to converse with God in perfect solitude. The Blessed Mother Teresa of Jesus relates of herself that in the commencement of her spiritual career, she had a singular devotion to those mysteries which represent only the person of our Lord, as during his prayer in the Garden of Olives, or when he waited for the Samaritan woman near the well. She thought that when her Divine Master was alone, he would attract her more powerfully, and that she would be sooner united to him. Love seeks not for witnesses of its words, and even when those who love have nothing to communicate which requires secrecy, they take pleasure in conversing in private. The reason of this probably is that they only speak for each other, and it would seem to them they did not speak for themselves alone if their interview could be overheard. Besides this, they make the most ordinary observations in a manner so peculiar as to mark the love from which their words proceed. There is nothing uncommon in the words they use, but the tone, the emphasis, and the manner which accompanies anything they say render their language so singular that they alone can understand it. The title of friend publicly conferred on an individual signifies but little, but when uttered in private it comprehends a great deal and becomes more expressive in proportion to the secrecy with which it is spoken. The difference between meditation and contemplation. Contemplation is nothing more than a loving and simple attention of the mind to divine truths, continued for some time. By comparing it with meditation, you will easily comprehend in what it consists. The young bees which have not begun to work are called nymphs, and when they commence to make honey, they are named bees. So it is with prayer. It is called meditation in the beginning, and when it has produced the love of God, it receives the name of contemplation. Bees fly through the fields about their hives to feed on the flowers and extract their juice, and after having laid up a sufficient provision, they continue to labor for the pleasure which the sweetness of the honey procures them. So we meditate to acquire the love of God, but after having obtained it, we contemplate, that is, we turn our attention to the divine goodness, being attracted by the ineffable sweetness which love discovers to us in this attention. A desire to obtain the love of God induces us to meditate, and love, when we have acquired it, leads us to contemplate. The knowledge of God is less necessary to us than love. The will, it is true, only tends to what is good through the medium of the understanding which proposes it to its view. But when it has once felt its attractions, it does not require the help of the understanding to attach itself thereto more and more closely, because the delight it takes in its object, and the pleasure it expects to derive from it by union, attract it to love and desire its enjoyment. Love resembles all other passions, of which knowledge is the principle and source, though not the rule and measure. We are induced to love God by the knowledge which faith gives. But when we have begun to love His infinite goodness, love increases our natural tendency thereto, as this inclination reciprocally augments love. How contemplation reduces all this to simple unity. We shall now consider how meditation is changed into contemplation. After the multiplied reflections which constitute meditation have excited devout and pious sentiments, we unite these different feelings and extract their essence and virtue. The peculiar qualities of each affection are thus mixed and united, and from this union proceeds an affection which may be called the substance and quintessence of all the others. It is in itself more lively and active than all the various affections from which it is derived, since it includes the virtues and various properties of each. It is termed the contemplative affection. Water separates into numerous streams in proportion as it runs farther from its source and forms several channels through which it flows, unless great care be taken to confine it to one. In the same manner, the perfections which all emanate from God divide in proportion as they are separated from this first principle, and according as they approach it, they reunite until they become totally engulfed in this one sovereign perfection, which is the one thing necessary, the better part chosen by Magdalene, which shall not be taken from her. The various means which lead to contemplation. As great assiduity in hearing the word of God is usually necessary for attaining contemplation, also spiritual conferences and discourses with pious persons, according to the example of the ancient fathers of the desert, the reading of spiritual works, prayer, meditation, singing the divine praises, and great care to occupy the mind with holy thoughts. And as contemplation is the term to which all these means are directed, those who perform these spiritual exercises are called contemplatives, and the manner in which they employ themselves is termed the contemplative life. This name is very applicable because the principal part of this manner of life consists in the operation of the understanding, by which we consider the beauty and the amiability of the sovereign being with an amorous attention, that is, with love which animates the attention of the mind, or with attention which proceeds from and increases love. Love collects the powers of the soul. It is the natural property of infinite goodness to attract and unite to itself everything capable of feeling its impressions. Our soul, which possesses this capability, always tends to what is good and inclines thereto as to its treasures or the object of its ardent love. When God infuses into the heart a certain indefinable sweetness, which proves that he is present in a particular manner, all the interior powers and even the exterior senses bend, as if by common consent, to this inmost part of the soul, to enjoy the company of the amiable and beloved spouse, who causes his presence to be so sensibly felt there. A person who has just communicated may, by the certainty which faith gives him, experience this truth revealed to him not by flesh and blood, but by the eternal Father himself, that by the adorable sacrament of the Eucharist, his body and soul enjoy the real presence of the body and soul of Jesus Christ. When the mother pearls have received the infusion of the drops of the morning dew, they always carefully close their shells, not only to preserve what they have collected, and prevent the sea water from mingling with the drops distilled from the heavens, but also because the freshness of the dew is analogous to their nature, and would afford them pleasure were they capable of feeling it. This is the case with many devout persons after they have participated in the sacrament by excellence, which contains the mystical dew of all heavenly graces and benedictions. Their soul then becomes consecrated in itself, not only to adore its King, who is present therein, but also to taste the inexpressible consolation and incredible heavenly sweetness springing from the germ of immortality, which by the light of faith they discover to have been planted in their hearts. We must not lose sight of what has been said at the commencement of this chapter, that the recollection of which we speak is the work of love, which, being first aware of the presence of God by the sweetness diffused in the heart, obliges the soul to unite its powers and attention and direct them to its beloved. All this is effected with ease and pleasure, love communicating to the soul an inclination to direct all its powers to God, who attracts them with so much sweetness. The infinite goodness of the Almighty attracts and binds all hearts more powerfully than cords and chains can fasten and restrain the body. Recollection is frequently produced and increased by a gentle, reverent fear. We must also observe that this recollection is not always produced by the sweet conviction that God is present in the heart. Other causes may produce a similar effect, provided they tend to place the soul in the divine presence. In attentively considering the sovereign majesty of God, who beholds us, we are sometimes seized with so lively a feeling of respect and delicious fear that all our interior powers are immediately concentrated and recollected in themselves, just as the unexpected presence of a great prince recalls the wandering thoughts of the most distracted mind, and produces the exterior respect and reverence due to the dignity of the person present. It is said that there are certain flowers which close their leaves when the sun shines and bloom again when his light is withdrawn. This is a figure of what occurs in the state of recollection of which we speak. At the remembrance of the presence of God, at the conviction that he looks on us from the height of his exalted throne in heaven, or from any part of the earth beyond ourselves, though we may not actually reflect on that ordinary presence by which he dwells within us, the powers of the soul, that they may be more undividedly directed to this divine object, immediately unite, animated with respect for the divine majesty, and a holy fear, springing from love, which gives much glory to God. Of the repose of a soul recollected in God. The soul, having entered into itself for the purpose of being wholly recollected in God or before God, is solely attentive to his sovereign goodness. But this attention is so simple, so sweet, so easy, so imperceptible, that the soul is sometimes not aware of being occupied. The operation which takes place in it is so delicate that it can scarcely perceive it, and is liable to mistake it, as we are sometimes deceived respecting the nature of rivers which flow very smoothly and calmly. Persons who sail on these rivers, or who look at them, imagine that they have no motion. They think they can neither see nor feel any, because there are no waves or billows to render the motion sensible. This is the sweet repose of the soul which St. Teresa terms prayer of quiet. It does not differ in the least from what she styles the sleep of the powers of the soul. This repose may be more or less profound. It sometimes increases to so great a degree that the soul appears to be asleep, and all its powers, except the will, seem inactive and motionless. It does nothing but receive the impressions of the happiness and satisfaction which result from the presence of its beloved. What is still more admirable is that the will enjoys this content without perceiving it, because the soul is entirely occupied with him whose presence constitutes its bliss, and its thoughts are quite diverted from itself. In this situation, it may be compared to a person who falls into a gentle sleep while surrounded by a large party. He partly sees what his friends are doing, he receives their caresses, but he does not notice them, because he is not reflecting on them, and is not aware of feeling them. However, the soul which in this sweet repose enjoys God by a feeling sense of his presence, without perceiving that it enjoys it, still clearly proves that it highly prizes this happiness, and prefers it to all others. When any event is about to deprive it of it, it then complains loudly. It grieves and even sheds tears like an infant which is awakened before it has slept sufficiently. It gives evidence of regret which plainly shows the satisfaction it derived from its slumber, since it weeps for its loss as for the privation of a great advantage. For this reason, the divine spouse, addressing the daughters of Jerusalem, conjures them by the roes and harts of the fields, not to stir up, nor make the beloved to awake, till she please. Canticles 2:7. It appears that Magdalene was absorbed in this prayer of quiet when, seated at our Redeemer's feet, she listened to his word. I pray you consider her attentively in this circumstance. She is seated perfectly tranquil. She utters not a word. No sigh escapes her heart. She sheds not a tear. No sob convulses her breast. No sigh escapes her heart. She is motionless. She does not pray. Martha passes from time to time through the room, but Mary is unconscious of her presence. What, then, is she doing? She is listening, that is all. She is in a state of total inaction. That is, she remains at Jesus' feet, like a precious vase, receiving drop by drop into her heart the sweet myrrh distilled by the lips of her beloved. Hence the divine bridegroom, jealous of his sacred spouse's repose, will not have Martha awaken her. Martha, Martha, he says, thou art careful and art troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part, which shall not be taken away from her. What was the part Mary had chosen? To remain recollected at the feet of Jesus, and to enjoy the peace and repose of this recollection. Remember then, Theotime, that if God attract you by this simple and filial confidence, you must remain tranquilly near him, without exerting yourself to make marked acts of the understanding or the will. For this loving confidence and repose of soul include excellently well all the exterior acts you could make to satisfy your inclination. It is better thus to sleep in the arms of our Saviour than to watch elsewhere. Of the manner in which the soul enjoys repose in God in the prayer of quiet. The soul in this state of holy recollection has no further need of the memory any more than of the understanding. When we are enjoying the presence of a friend, we need not tax our imagination to represent him to us. It suffices that our will come forward and accept the sweetness of the divine presence. The other powers, without making any effort, have only to enjoy the repose which God's presence affords. Wine mingled with honey is used, as we have already observed, to recall the fugitive bees to the hive. It is also employed to appease them when they mutiny and destroy one another. The person who superintends the hive throws some of the mixture into it, and the most seditious of the bees, attracted by the agreeable perfume, seem to forget their enmity, and are only occupied in tranquilly enjoying the sweets presented to them. O my God, when by thy amiable presence thou infusest into our hearts thy heavenly perfumes, far more fragrant than wine and honey, all our interior powers cease to act and enter into delicious repose, which imparts so great a calm and such perfect content that not one of them attempts the slightest motion. The will alone, which may be termed the spiritual sense of smell, is sweetly occupied in feeling without perceiving the inestimable advantage which results from the presence of God. Of the different degrees of the prayer of quiet and the means which should be employed to preserve the holy repose of the soul. The minds of some persons are active and abound in thoughts and arguments. Others find great facility in considering and accounting for what occurs within them. They wish to see and examine everything, to reflect continually on what passes in their interior, and to account to themselves for everything they do. In order to be assured of their advancement, they are incessantly considering their operations and always occupied with themselves. There are others who are not satisfied with being contented unless by marked acts they feel their happiness. These last may be compared to persons who, being defended against the inclemency of the weather by warm clothing, cannot be persuaded that this is the case unless they know the quality and quantity of their clothes, or who, finding their coffers replenished with riches, cannot believe themselves wealthy unless they know exactly the number of pieces of gold and silver which compose their treasure. The minds of these different characters are liable to be disturbed and distracted during prayer. If the Almighty introduce them to the holy repose of recollection in his presence, they will voluntarily quit it to consider how they acted while it lasted, and if their happiness be great, they will sacrifice the tranquillity they enjoy to examine the extent of their calm and peace. Instead of occupying their will in tasting the ineffable delights of the divine presence, they will invite their understanding to reason on the sweetness of these delights. In this they are like a spouse who, instead of being occupied with her bridegroom, amuses herself with examining the ring he gave her on the day of their marriage. Ah, what a difference, Theotime, there is between being occupied in God, who constitutes our happiness, and occupying ourselves with the contentment which God gives us. Therefore a soul which God invites to rest lovingly in him in the prayer of quiet should abstain as much as possible from reflections on itself and its state. The repose it enjoys is extremely delicate. A look suffices to prove a disturbance thereto, or even to destroy it effectually. To preserve it, it should be careful not even to be aware of its existence. By being too much attached to this prayer, it forfeits it. The real way to love its sweets is not to be anxious to know the extent of its enjoyment, that thereby it may not be tempted to attach its affections thereto. If it happen during the enjoyment of holy repose in prayer that a soul is tempted by curiosity and distracted by reflecting on what occurs within it, it should quickly oblige its heart to resume the sweet and peaceful attention to the presence of God from which its thoughts have strayed. However, we must not imagine that we are in danger of forfeiting this holy quiet on account of movements either of mind or body, in which levity and indiscretion have no share. For, as Saint Teresa observes, it is a species of superstition to be so jealous of our repose as to refrain from coughing, and almost from breathing, for fear of losing it. God, who is the author of this peace, will not deprive us of it for such motions of the body as are unavoidable, or even for involuntary distractions and wanderings of the mind. Though the understanding and the memory may escape the bounds of restraint and wander on strange and useless thoughts, yet the will, when once attracted by the charms of the divine presence, will still continue to enjoy the same delights. It is true that the calm is not then so perfect as it would be if the understanding and the memory were in union with the will. Yet a real spiritual tranquillity is certainly and effectually enjoyed, since it resides in the will, which governs all the other powers of the soul. It is, however, certain that the soul would enjoy more calm and sweeter peace if no noise were made near it, and that it could refrain from all interior and exterior motion. It would willingly devote its attention solely to the divine presence, which imparts such ineffable delights. But it cannot always prevent some of its faculties from disturbing it, and then, not to incur the privation of its repose, it concentrates itself in its will, this being the power through which it enjoys the presence of its spouse. When the will is attracted and sweetly restrained by the happiness it derives from the presence of God, it should not endeavour to recall the other powers when they are diverted from this object. Thus to separate from its divine spouse would be to sacrifice its repose. Its effort to recall the attention of these volatile powers would also prove vain and ineffectual. Besides, nothing is more efficacious in bringing them back to their duty than the tranquil perseverance of the will in holy quiet, because the heavenly sweetness diffused in the heart as a perfume whose fragrance is gradually communicated to all the powers of the soul, invites them to return and unite themselves to the will that they may share its happiness. Self-denial is the safest means of establishing ourselves in the presence of God. How excellent a method of preserving ourselves in the presence of God is it to abandon ourselves to His will forever. By this means we can always have God present, even in the most profound sleep, which deprives us of our will. Therefore nothing can establish us more perfectly in that species of presence of which we treat. If we love God, we must be anxious never to lose sight of Him. We fall asleep not only under His eyes, but in the manner most pleasing to His divine majesty, not only to conform to His holy will, but through the pure and sole motive of conformity. During sleep we are abandoned to the will of God. Consequently, we are in His presence. We could not be more so if God Himself were to lay us in our beds, as a sculptor places his statue in a niche. Those who live in a state of continual submission to the will of God never quit His divine presence. The couch on which they repose cannot interrupt it, as the nest in which the feathered songsters take their rest does not prevent their being under the unsleeping eye and untiring care of Providence. If we reflect on this truth on awakening, we should be easily convinced that God has been ever present to us, and that our slumbers have not separated us from Him. And why? Because we have slept, as it were, under the shadow and immediate protection of His holy will. We might then truly exclaim with Jacob, "The Lord has indeed been with me. I have slept in His presence. I have been cradled in the arms of His paternal providence, and I knew it not." Perfect submission to the will of God keeps the soul in continual prayer. This sort of quiet in which the will does nothing but simply acquiesce in the will of God, remaining in His presence without aiming at anything higher than to remain near Him in conformity to His will, is a sovereignly excellent prayer, because self-interest has no share therein. The faculties of the soul derive no satisfaction from it, and even the will only enjoys it by soaring to the highest regions of the mind, which is called the most sublime spot, where it simply acquiesces in the will of God and is satisfied at His leaving it destitute of happiness in order to procure His own felicity. To pronounce, in a word, the eulogium of this species of prayer, the sovereign perfection of love, which is ecstatic by nature, consists in paying no attention whatever to our happiness, but solely to that of the Almighty, or, in other words, in desiring no other satisfaction than that which God derives from the accomplishment of His ever adorable will.